One of the most important parts of getting your game made as a game designer is pitching your design to a publisher. In a pitch, you try and describe your game as succinctly as possible, hopefully piquing the interest of a publisher and getting them interested in publishing your game and selling it to the public. But what if I was to tell you that the most important thing to get right with your pitch had nothing to do with your game? Hi, I'm Matthew Dunstan. I'm a full-time game designer based in Australia, and to date I've had over 60 games published all around the world in many different languages. On this channel, I like to talk about all things game design, what it's like being a full-time game designer, and try and offer some advice and tips for you if you're starting on your own journey becoming a game designer. So, I won't leave you in suspense for much longer. In my opinion, the most important thing about your pitch is actually yourself. Yes, that's right, you are more important than the game you are pitching. In this video, I'll go over a few reasons why it's so important to sell yourself in a pitch, and how that can lead to more opportunities down the road. In the first half of the video, I'm going to talk about why you are in fact the most important part of your pitch, and how it can help or hinder you in the game publishing process. In the second part, I'll talk about some do's and don'ts of pitching through this lens that might improve your success in the future. Let me ask you a question. What do you think is the number one priority you have when you're about to pitch a game to a publisher, especially when you're meeting that publisher for the first time? A lot of you would say, well, to try and present your game well and sell it to the publisher. But for me, my number one priority when I meet a publisher, especially for the first time, is to leave that meeting having the publisher be eager to meet with me again. In my experience, pitching is all about developing a relationship with the publisher. Getting a game signed by a publisher, in some ways, is a lucky thing. You need to have the right game at the right time with the right publisher. And there are so many things out of your control in that process. You could have an amazing game that is excellent, that your playtesters love, and that a prospective audience that would really want to buy. But if the publisher you're pitching to doesn't have any room in their catalogue, or maybe they've just signed a game that's really similar to yours, well, they're not going to be interested in signing your game, irregardless of how good it is, and irregardless of how professional your pitch is in describing how it works. However, if you're able to present yourself in a great light, and strike up a rapport with the person you're pitching to, even if they're not interested in your game at that moment, you can be certain that they'll want to meet with you again in the future and see what other games you're working on. The first time you meet a publisher can be through many different ways. Sometimes it might be over email, sometimes it might be in an in-person meeting, sometimes it might be over a video call. In each of these different situations, you have a chance to present yourself as a professional, as someone that publisher will want to work with for this game or for some future project. Remember, if they sign your game, they're not just signing the game, they're kind of signing you, because they're signing up to work with you to develop that game further, to potentially promote the game, and to talk about where the game should go as you both work on it together. And as many of you might know, having a good colleague or co-worker is so important when working on a project, and that publisher's trying to work out if you're going to be a good colleague. This industry is all about building relationships with publishers, and ultimately you have very little control about whether a publisher is going to take your game or not and ultimately publish it. But the thing you do have control over is building a relationship with that publisher so that you'll have more chances to show them more of your games and potentially get more opportunities to work with them in the future. I was lucky enough to be able to go to Essen every year for about 10 years when I lived in Europe. I would meet publishers for the first time at that fair in person, and I would show them some of my games. Often at the end of the meeting, the publishers would pass on the games, saying that they weren't for them. But hopefully I'd presented myself in a professional kind of manner in those meetings, so that when Essen rolled around the next year, you can bet that many of those publishers actually reached out to me and contacted me saying, do I have any games to show them and would I like to schedule a meeting? If I hadn't thought about the way I was presenting myself in that first pitch meeting, then I might never get another chance to pitch that publisher, and I might miss a chance sometime in the future when I have the perfect game at the perfect time for that particular publisher, and we'll be able to make a game together. And there are many other benefits to having good relationships with publishers. Often publishers are looking for a particular type of game at a particular time. For example, they might have a new line of roll and write games, and they might have the first game in the line, but they're looking for the next two. And so they might tell you, well, we're looking for roll and write games. And you might luckily already have designed one which you can show them, and that's the perfect thing to be able to show them at that time. Or you might be inspired and go away and make a game that you can show them. And that's one step up from showing a game randomly to a publisher hoping that they want it. Additionally, sometimes publishers will contact designers to work on specific intellectual properties or other projects where they're looking for design to be done to spec effectively. I've worked on a few projects like that in the past, and I hope to make some videos in the future about that process. But those opportunities only came up because I already had good relationships with those publishers. I should say that these relationships aren't reliant on making games with the publishers. For instance, I met with the publisher Cosmos for 6 or 7 years, meeting the same person every year at Essen, and they never were interested in any one of my games, until one day they were. And to date, I've published a number of games with that company. But if I had given up, or if I hadn't presented myself well in those first 5 or 6 years, then I would have never got to that 7th or 8th year when I'd finally break through and have the right game at the right time. Another important aspect of selling yourself as a good person to work with and creating a good relationship with a publisher is that it's something you have control over. You don't work at the publisher, you don't decide what games they're going to publish or not, or what they're going to want at what particular time, or whether they're going to get in contact with you, but you can control how you're going to present yourself in those pitch opportunities. And on the other side, if you present yourself poorly, well, publishers talk to each other. The industry's fairly small. So if you treat someone badly in a meeting, come off as someone that a publisher wouldn't want to work with, it's a fair chance they might tell other publishers about that particular experience, and that might negatively affect your opportunity to be able to pitch to even other publishers you might not have even met yet. On the flip side, if you have a good reputation, sometimes publishers will even help you set up meetings with other publishers that you've never met with, and they might even make the introduction for you because they've had a good experience meeting with you in that pitch. So, if pitching yourself is really important, how do you do it effectively? Firstly, some practical matters. When you're setting up the meeting and in all the communication around it, try to be professional and punctual as you can. So if you get an email, try and respond in a reasonable amount of time, 1 to 2 days if possible. Be polite and firm in what you're looking for, and try to be clear when you're setting the meeting time, whether it's for a voice call or for a meeting in person. If you're cold at emailing a publisher, first work out, are they accepting submissions? There are a lot of resources out there, such as the Cardboard Edison database, that tracks which publishers are looking for submissions and the email addresses you can contact. So that's a good idea to check whether the publisher's on there, firstly to see that you're not wasting someone's time. Secondly, once you have that right contact, do a little bit of research. Try and work out what the contact's name is, potentially what position they are at the company, and be familiar with what types of game that publisher makes. So in that first introductory email, introduce yourself as a game designer, as someone who would potentially like to work with that publisher, and potentially show that you have some knowledge about the publisher. For instance, you might mention 1 or 2 titles that they've recently published, and potentially 1 or 2 features of those games that might fit well with the features of the games you make, or the particular game you're trying to pitch. In that first contact email, all you're trying to do is to get a meeting, or effectively permission to contact that publisher again. So don't try and be too pushy, but be to the point, ask if they're accepting submissions, and if there is a way to pitch them either in person at a convention or online via video chat or similar. Keep the email short and to the point. Remember, these publishers get a lot of emails this way. And try and avoid attaching too much to the email about your own game. Remember, it's better first to check whether they're looking for games before you dump a new game on them unwillingly. Sometimes in this instance, having a short 1 to 2 minute video describing your game can be something you can add as a link within that initial email, and it's up to them whether they want to watch that or not, and that can be a really quick and unobtrusive way for them to check out your game and whether they want to know more. A follow-up to this is don't hound a publisher for a response too quickly after that initial email. As I said before, remember, publishers get a lot of these emails, and sometimes one person has to deal with a lot of them. I would say about a month after that initial email is a fair amount of time to send a quick follow-up email, just checking whether they received it and if they had any feedback. Unfortunately, even with the best of intentions, sometimes you won't get a response, and you just have to respect that. And that's the downside of having cold email contact with a publisher. If you're able to get an actual pitch meeting with a publisher, either in person or over video chat, then you have a much better opportunity to strike up a relationship with them. Sometimes when I meet a new publisher, I like to start the pitch meeting actually asking a little bit about the publisher, asking what kind of games they're looking for at the moment, what sort of plans they have for their lines in the coming years, as this can be potentially different from the games they've previously published. Remember, publishers are working on games for many years before they're released. So when you're pitching to someone, they're working on things that you haven't even seen yet. I find it's a really good way to break the ice and gives you a lot of information that you can tailor your subsequent pitch. For example, if they say they're targeting a particular audience with a new line of games, then you can work that into your pitch and highlight why your game might be a really good fit with that particular audience. They might talk about a particular form factor that they're exploring in a new line of games. Maybe they're doing a line of small box games that are mainly cards with a few small components. And that might suggest which game to pitch to them between what you have. If you have something that fits that particular material limit, then that might be a really good pitch. In terms of the actual pitch, it's a subject for a bit of a bigger video about the pitch itself, but try and be concise. Try to show the game in an understandable manner. I would practice before you have the meeting, practice on some friends and see if it makes sense to them. What you're trying to do is step the publisher through what's the overall information about the game, who's it for, how many players, what's the kind of range of components, what's the style of game it is, maybe showing them a few of the rules or a flow of the game, and then highlighting some potential interactions or some examples of turns. Depending on the meeting, you might be able to go over the whole rules and effectively show them the whole game if you've got enough time. And this is something to check at the start of the meeting, how much time you have and how much detail they'd like you to go into with the pitch. Again, don't be afraid of asking questions. They'll give you feedback as to what they're looking for in the pitch. And publishers are often looking for different things, so it's another good reason to check. If the publisher has questions, answer them truthfully and really try and listen to what they're asking and giving you feedback on. Remember, they're giving their time to look at your game, and their feedback can be really useful in terms of improving your game. Even if they're not going to publish it, they can really help you out. And it's also just polite to be able to show that you value their time and you value their opinion. Finally, do keep an eye on the time and don't go over the time for your allotted meeting. If you have multiple games that you're going to show, try and think about how you're going to fit that into the time, and potentially only select 1 or 2 games to show a publisher. The worst thing is to show up and try and sell 5 games in 15 minutes and have not enough time to describe any of them in great detail. Remember, your priority is for them to want to meet with you again, not to necessarily show them all the games you've designed. If you have a lot of games, you can ask at the start of the meeting, I've got these 3 or 4 games, and you can give them a very quick 1-sentence description of each of them, and then they might tell you which ones they'd be interested in showing. Of course, you can also figure this out via email before the meeting as to what they might be looking for. At the end of the meeting, thank them for their time, and do send a follow-up after the meeting via email, summarizing what you pitched them, attaching the rules or a gameplay video for their reference so they have something to follow up on after the meeting. And remember, after you've sent that first email, wait at least a month before you get back in contact with a publisher. Remember, publishers often receive a lot of pitches and they can take many months to sift through everything they've been shown. So again, in these follow-up emails, be polite, be concise, and be understanding with the amount of time that a publisher might have to look at your pitch. Something to have in the back of your mind through the whole of this process is, how can I show the publisher that I kind of know something about what I'm talking about? And what do I mean by this? Anecdotally, talking to publishers, they get pitched a lot of games. A large percentage of these games are designed by people who aren't really aware of the modern hobby or the modern trend of board game design. So we're talking about like a new Monopoly or a Scrabble clone, games like this. A publisher is not going to publish one of these games, and they're not going to react very well if you start a pitch saying, well, I've designed the next Monopoly. Conversely, if there's a way that you can show the publisher that you are aware of the modern industry, the types of games that are getting released, the types of trends and wants from the audience, all of that shows the publisher that you've done your research, you're aware of what modern design is like, and then they can be confident that what you're showing them might fit in what they're looking for. It gives you that extra chance that they might look at your game for a little bit longer or with a different set of eyes than they would if they got the 100th Monopoly clone email. It's somewhat of a soft skill, and I'm not saying you have to develop that from the very first contact, but that's just something to have in mind when you're building this relationship. It's not that you're necessarily competing against other designers to get a publisher's time. You're trying to delineate yourself from designers who don't really know what's going on in the modern design hobby. So I hope this video was of use to you, especially as you consider pitch your game to a publisher in the future. And as I always say, take what's useful for you and discard the rest. I definitely, in future videos, will go more into the pitching process and what might be useful for you. And if you have specific questions or things you'd like me to cover in future videos, do let me know in the comments below. But until then, all the best with your designing, and I'll see you next time. Bye!